labor. Let's take a look on this whole chapter concept of what an organized labor group is all about. I want to start talking about with the labor relations background. What are some of the laws that really happen? If you go back historically, unions today are only a shadow of what the power they wielded once upon a time. But the power they wielded, there's an awful lot of good things that happened out of the aspect of the original roots of the labor movement. Once upon a time in our nation, we had children working in factories at the ripe old age of 12 years old, 11, and even 10. Once upon a time, you had to work 6 or 7 days a week. Once upon a time, we didn't have a thing called time and a half or overtime. Those things simply didn't exist. Once upon a time, we never had workers' compensation. If an employee sat down there, they lost an arm or a hand in a machine, and they couldn't come to work the next day, they were fired. This is part of the history that really spawned the aspect of unions. There's an awful lot of history there, but nowadays people seem to think that unions have worked themselves out and are unions relevant. Let's take a look and see what the market is like when we look in the background. Employees have the right to what we call self-organize or form and join a union, and it's based upon collecting cards and having enough signatures, and they turn them into the National Labor Relations Board. This all comes from the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. That really was one of the more aspects of cementing unions into the actual fabric of our society. At the core of union activity is a thing called collective bargaining. Yes, you have to go through collective bargaining. And I notice how I drop my voice down. Whenever you talk about collective bargaining, you have to drop your voice down because it's really cool, it's a lot of fun, and people enjoy having a party. No, not really. Anyway, so collective bargaining, we typically sit down and you'll have management on one side, the union on the other side, and you sit down and you present your different aspects as to what you want to talk about. In essence, I want this in your notes. Wages, hours, and working conditions. I'll be mentioning this throughout this entire chapter. The three things that federal law says that the union has the right to negotiate with management is wages, hours, and working conditions. The three things. That covers an awful lot. Once you sit down and you have these dialogues, eventually, hopefully you come to closure on it and you get a collective bargaining agreement. The slang for it is a CBA. It's also a labor contract or the contract. You'll have different terminology for it, but in essence, it's a formal written agreement from the union side and the management side. They've come to agree on it. They both vote on it. They formalize it. And they also have a document that works together between the two of them that defines the working relationship. Sometimes it goes very quickly. Sometimes it can take a long time to do it. And then also, the only thing is sometimes it's the collective bargaining agreement. Sometimes they can evolve or devolve depending upon what it was, and they get micro when the union has nothing left to talk about, or management wants to sit down and nitpick over something. It just depends the mood that the people are on either side of it. So you'll see an evolution of them. Normally there's 10 to 12 different articles in them, but I've seen them as much as 23 different articles in it where each article deals with a separate component. It just depends what it is. But remember, it always deals with wages, hours, and working conditions. So how healthy is union membership? At the time of this recording, the union membership on a national basis in the United States dropped down to single digits, 9.9%. It's been dropping from over 20% once upon a time, almost 30%, down to just 10%. You'll see here that the numbers, now technically the 9.9% are paid union members, but there's 10.1% because there's some people that benefit from the union but are not union members, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. You'll see the private sector, there's only 5.9% of all the employees in the private sector, which is huge. A big part of our economy are union members. The public sector has got 32.3%. And we'll talk about that aspect because that's critical, because that is either a positive or negative depending upon which side of the table that you're sitting on. I'm talking to you as an actual practitioner. I've literally been on both sides of the table negotiating for union and also negotiating for management. So I've seen both sides, and I've done rather well at it. That's kind of a specialty that I have. But the reality of it comes down to there's a reason why we have such a huge, almost a 500+% difference between public sector versus private sector. If you look on the aspect of what are the occupation rates, about 34%, 35% are education, training, library, or whatever in the process. You look in the aspect of you have almost no unions in the finance or technical services, but really by the time you're all done looking at it, you have the unions. They tend to make about $187 higher on a regular basis, on a weekly basis, than non-union members. No matter what happens, there are issues with unions that people always have, but here's the simple truth. Most union members make more than their non-union counterparts. But you also have some differences. Construction industry, people bounce from job to job to job. A job might last 3 or 4 months and they bounce to a different job. That's pretty common. So you have different issues like that. But the reality is the typical union worker makes more money. Besides a shrinking union, okay, you have the aspect of, men versus women. You have that aspect of it. Usually full-time workers are twice as likely to be union members. Hawaii is the highest rate of unionization that we have in our country. California is close behind. Surprisingly, New York is actually hugely union in that aspect. So you'll see different states depends upon how they are with this whole aspect of the shrinking union. You'll see in the South, there's far less unions than there are in the North. So you have different regional aspects of unions as to what they really focus in on as to what's important to them in the workplace. So when we look on that, it really comes back from the 1800s. It really comes from the aspect of shoemakers and silver makers. They were the original craft unions, and so they called them guilds at the time, Guilds. So they were guilds. Literally on the bottom of some ancient silverware, you'll see stamped on there the name of the silversmith as well as the guild they were in. The shoemakers of all things. You can always tell that they're really always on cutting edge because of the fact that they have a lot of soul. Anyhow. So I know I'm a heel for actually bringing up things about show, but I might have to go tie one on later on. But that being said, when it comes down to the union, we really came out of the skilled trade industry in that aspect and then evolved across that into the early 1900s. And you'll see a lot of changes happen right there. The book refers here to the Commonwealth versus Hunt about concerted action, but really the union movement started in the late 1800s and then moved into the early 1900s. You have an awful lot of things. You had a thing called a yellow dog contract. Now, by the way, I think yellow dog is discriminatory, so I put an orange cat in. Maybe it should be an orange cat contract. That's a yellow dog contract. Anyhow, so the agreements units, what people would come into the company, and the employer would say, okay, you need to sign this agreement that you are not part of a union right now and never will be. Yes, yes, and you must just sit down there and sign it in blood. So here I got a needle to stick your finger with it. No, it wasn't quite like that, but really the yellow dog contract was common. Employers did not want people joining unions. They wanted them to do what they were told and go by all the rules of the workplace without anybody being part of a union that could become compared to them. So you'll see here you got the antitrust attacks with the Sherman Antitrust Act. You'll also see the yellow dog contract, the legal basis, the stop injunctions. It was outlawed in 1932. There's a lot of intense activity between really the Clayton activity of 1914 to 1932, and you also had some aspects that really drove the unionization even much stronger than we see today. You had literally Henry Ford with the assembly line worker that you had that he actually developed. Henry Ford is credited a lot of times, if you read history, with almost creating the middle class in America. He put a car down so that the average person could start buying them, but then with the union, he had to pay the workers enough to buy the cars he was making. It actually fed itself, except for the fact that there's a lot of different difficulties with strike breakers being hired to come in with clubs. And literally in Chicago one year, they killed several strikers. It was an ugly, ugly time back in the early 1900s. So you see that the unions have different aspects they can do. They have strikes. They also have a thing, that's probably their biggest tool, but another tactic is called a secondary boycott. I've never understood that. It seems to be kind of stupid from my perspective, just from a common sense aspect. But I'm going to go on strike. Well, I understand the strike thing because you're angry with that worker, but a secondary boycott, we're going to sit down there and pick on that person because we're buying supplies for them. Yes, let's go destroy that other company. For all the years I've been involved with unions, secondary boycotts don't seem to be very practical, except for the fact that I'm not in charge of whatever union is using that at the moment. So that being said, that's up to their aspect of it. Supreme Court voided a lot of different aspects, and they talked about the interstate commerce. Unions were confined to local areas, but as soon as the unions started going across lines, Supreme Court really got involved in the aspect, and so did the Congress in passing laws to protect them because they became involved in interstate commerce, going over interstate lines. So you'll see a lot of different aspects. In the 1970s, we had a decrease in private sector unionization. I'm not certain what drove that aspect of it, but the reality was we lost a massive amount of manufacturing. Once upon a time, we had this economy that was balanced 50-50, even 55 to 45 of manufacturing and service industry. Today, our economy stands with 80% of American work being part of the service industry and only 20% being manufacturing. Companies started shipping work out. If you have to sit down and myself coming from the Midwest and the auto industry played a huge part of the entire economy. It still does, but not as dominant as it used to be. But the reality of it is that instead of paying somebody $30 an hour, and a $15 an hour benefit package, so $45 an hour, you can ship it to Mexico. You can ship it to South America and Brazil. You could ship it over to whatever other country and get the work done for 1/10 the price. Well, of course, they looked at the bottom line. How do we make more profit? They would ship the work out, so we had a huge decrease in the amount of the super heavy industries, and unionization dropped. Unions have a shrinking population. The public sector has a much larger percentage of union members than private, and keep in mind the three areas that are mandated by federal law that unions have a legal right to negotiate with management are wages, hours, and working condition. That's a foundation for labor relations on which we have our union management relationship built upon today. Take care.